Working Group webinar. Just to briefly introduce myself, my name is Rob Chase. I am the co-chair of the Fragile States Working Group, along with Jonathan Papolidis and Pallavi Roy. And we have the pleasure today of having an exciting series of presentations to discuss some of the work that we talk about in the Scaling Community of Practice, which is trying to share ideas across lots of different actors in lots of different settings about what works, what are some of the ways in which you can keep things that work growing or scaling, and having that scale grow both across space and time. And so part of what we're very, very pleased to have a discussion of today is scaling education in emergencies and protracted crises innovations, lessons from the UNHCR Humanitarian Education Accelerator. So we've got a great lineup of speakers today, and I don't want to take too much time in introducing them, but would like to welcome Becky Telford, who's the Chief of Education for UNHCR, and she'll be starting the presentation. And then we have a team of Doha and Abi, who are talking about the from NYU's Global Ties for Children program. And then we'll have from the Cohere Bondeka team, Carol, Angela, and Paul, who will give us a talk about an example of some of the work that they've done from Uganda. So very, very pleased to have this conversation be launched. I see lots of people are joining, so I'm going to give just another minute. But first, I'd like to welcome Becky at Telford as Chief of Education for UNHCR to open the conversation about the Humanitarian Education Accelerator. So Becky, over to you.
Great, thank you so much. And I'm also very happy to see all the people on the call. This has been a long and exciting journey. And I think I'm just going to talk a little bit in the introduction about kind of how necessary it is and some of the kind of things that we've been learning. So I think we came to the creation of the Humanitarian Education Accelerator very much with the recognition that education in emergencies and protracted crises, or EiEPC, is under-prioritized and underfunded in humanitarian and international development. So it doesn't have the visibility, it doesn't have the funding, either in humanitarian response plans or under development actors. And I think there's been a recognition of that in recent years. But with COVID-19, with socioeconomic downturn, with limited funding going to education across the board, and with increasing numbers of humanitarian and displacement crises, the situation is really getting a lot worse. I think common to all of us is the need to look for these kind of innovative education solutions. I think the scale of some of these issues are so broad and can feel so overwhelming, but we know that some small approaches and innovative solutions can actually make a tremendous difference. So looking to actually identify those impactful innovations and then looking at how to support them to scale, it hasn't really been a straightforward process. There's not a kind of obvious way that it happens. There's not obvious ways that you design, that you work on your business plan, you build your relationships. And there's also quite little evidence in terms of what works. So I think looking at not just what works in terms of delivering on learning outcomes, but also what works in terms of the enabling environment and support that is needed to take things to scale. So with all of that recognition, the HA was set up to look at three things in particular. One was to actually identify these innovations. Where are they? Who are they? What's happening? Secondly, looking to support that transition to scale and meaningfully engage to help those innovations achieve what they could. And then the third is to build this evidence base. And I think that evidence base is very much understanding what works and why. So HA was launched in 2016. It's been around for a while. We've seen increasing crises and challenges in that time, but we've also seen changes in relationships and technology, which means there are options and opportunities to become more nimble, more agile, and to build relationships and support it in quite new ways as well. Originally, it was funded by the UK Department for International Development, now FCDO, and it was co-led by UNHCR and UNICEF. And I think it's interesting from a kind of institutional perspective to note that in kind of building out the HEA itself, we had to learn about building different partnerships and what those partnerships could engage with. So in terms of what the HEA has done, we've completed 3 cohorts, and that's of an accelerator program. So there's 2 full accelerator phases, which were 1 and 2, and that's putting in place some kind of more robust support. And under COVID, we actually had a completely unexpected pivot and did a shorter cohort, really looking at responding to the challenges of COVID, but doing it very, very rapidly because that was essential at the time. So the first phase ran for 3 years and looked at providing funding and mentorship to 5 innovative education programs from around the world. And the mentorship there focused very much on capacity strengthening and looking at scaling skills, which are sometimes outside of the traditional approaches that we have in funding education. So looking very much at monitoring, evaluation, lesson learning, and evidence generation to build up the research base, but also to build the capacity across the education architecture to work on those kind of approaches. And after phase 1 finished, Education Cannot Wait generously granted HEA funds to run a second accelerator. And that focused on Education Cannot Wait MERP countries, which is where they have their big investments. I think that was an interesting engagement with a partner who were also saying, you know, we have significant funding. We're looking at trying to support what works and to be more innovative and to look for new solutions. And that relationship with ECW, I think, has been really critical and helps us think about the link between donors, implementers, and kind of policy side. However, as noted, COVID struck, and so ECW agreed to a no-cost extension, and we did pivot the programme and run this 6-month challenge. As I'm sure we all remember, digital and remote learning became absolutely critical in COVID disruption, and I think a lot of lessons were generated at that time, and a lot of innovations were able to be rolled out. And we were able to be a part of that by supporting 3 teams, giving them funding and innovation support during that period. So phase 2 came after that, and the main kind of HEA was launched. And so we were able to build in some of the feedback from phase 1 on this. Phase 2 used a stage-gated approach to selecting teams, which is a very old school innovations term, but basically means that, you know, you put it in place, it gives you more time to make assessments, to understand what the innovations are, opportunities to look at non-financial support to maybe a greater number of shortlisted teams, and then really looking at going through these kind of stage gates so that final funding support is given to those grantees who are truly ready. HEA for that phase 2 received 160 applications. And I think that was a real testament to us about the need for this kind of approach, the excitement that is around being supported to scale, but also the number of great ideas that there are out there. So again, we had 3 teams in this final cohort, which you're going to hear a lot more about today. And over 2 years, they received funding, coaching, mentorship. I know they also provided peer mentorship and support to each other. And that came in the form of, you know, working from HEA, from partners, from UNHCR and others. And so one of those teams is going to present fully today. That's Cohere. And shortly we'll show you a few short videos so you can get an idea of the innovation projects that HEA has supported. And finally, just a bit about lessons that we've learned. And there's obviously a lot more information on this available in the documents that we have. And I would really invite you to go and have a look at those. So HEA has now come to an end after now quite a number of years. And I think there are lessons which we've learned from each of the cohorts. And they're lessons which are important to education, humanitarian and innovation communities, and particularly where we have kind of bottlenecks or struggles at the juxtaposition of those 3. One of the reasons HEA has focused kind of very strongly on capturing these in global public goods has been a recognition that people really do want this information. You know, people want to fund more effectively, to fund better, to work with maybe small solutions, work with localization, implementers, and exciting ideas. And there is a lot of appetite for it. So Kate, who you can see on screen, who's the HEA research and learning consultant, is going to tell you about some of those publications at the end of this webinar. And also 2 of the presenters, NYU-TIES and Cohere, are going to really go into some of those lessons and experiences in scaling EiEPC innovations, and we'll also give you an idea of the kind of lessons that we have found in depth. So very quickly, and just to set the scene, I think the main lessons learned that we've had are a number of things, and probably none of these are a surprise, but it's really helpful to have them with an evidence base behind them and with the kind of global public goods that we need to go out and work on this jointly as the global education architecture. So I think the first is that sectoral barriers still remain. The incentives across the humanitarian sector, the way it's funded, how things engaged, are really in the position where they support perpetual pilots rather than scaling up. We have a lot more information on this, but I think even when you're ready and you know what you're looking for as an innovation, these sectoral barriers means that it might not be possible to find it. This one, which I think is really significant, and something that we look forward to conversation on, is that a financing pipeline needs to be created and maintained. So this isn't unique to kind of EiEPC and the humanitarian side, but there's a real gap between innovation startup type funds and sustainable long-term funding. Donors and funders, work in education in a lot of these settings, and so do governments, but looking really realistically at how things get scaled, what those financing pipelines look like is really critical, especially in terms of planning and in terms of putting together business modeling. And that does also link to the overall piece on financing in EiEPC, which is about creating really strong pipelines across the nexus from that humanitarian support, designing for inclusion and designing for development, and getting into development partners and, where relevant, domestic finance. So evidence generation is another one. It's really critical. And I think not just generating evidence, not just generating kind of, really robust evidence, which is important as well, but building in monitoring and evaluation skills and learning skills into partners, into kind of innovative processes, and into donors and others in the sector, so that funding is able to go to things that we know work, right? And one of the things that we found is that actually scaling funding should specifically target the development of those skills and capacities, because without them, it's very hard to make decisions, and it's also very hard as an innovation to really pivot and know what's going on. And I'm looking forward to hearing from NYU-TIES about their work and the kind of mentoring they've done on the M&E teams. And the last one is around skills and knowledge for scale. So there are a lot of tools. There's a lot of tools which are out there. And I think what we found across the whole period of the HEA is that innovators need to focus on developing theories of change. They need to look particularly at codification of innovations and M&E, and looking at having those skills not just sit with one person, but how they can be really built into the team, built into local partners, and become part of that broader ecosystem. Cohere are presenting today, and they're going to talk about how their own team strengthened these skills and how they worked with refugee-led organisations such as Bond Echo Centre to strengthen their capacities and ensure that those things are embedded. So all of these lessons will be talked about more, and they're all captured in the learning synthesis that Kate is going to discuss at the end of the webinar. So I'm going to hand back, I believe, over to NYU-TIES, but I think it's going to be short videos first, so it's over from me. Thank you.
I'm Felicia Lee, and I'm the Global Programs Manager at IACT.
My name is Julia Schacht. I'm a Programs Associate with IACT.
The program that we've been working on with HEA is called Little Ripples. Little Ripples is a play-based, trauma-informed, community-led early childhood education program that offers children ages 3 to 5 affected by conflict a safe space to develop social, emotionally, cognitively, and physically. This program is led by members of the community whom we train to lead, manage, implement, and scale the program. One key learning for us as a team, and especially for me personally through this process, is how important it is to really sit down and spell out and figure out all the exact steps we need to take to get from A to B. So, if we have a goal, we need to really sit down and think about, like, these are all the steps that we need to take to get to that goal. One thing that I think our team is most proud of that's happened in our scaling journey is we've been able to scale. So we had a goal to expand the program within 2 camps that already had Little Ripples, and then to a camp that didn't have Little Ripples. And so our team in Eastern Chad has already done that. And I just think that's really cool that, we were trying to do that and we're doing it. And now I know there's a long road ahead, but community-led scaling works, and it's happening already.
We know that our community-led scaling model works, and we know that we need to prove it, but we have been stuck in a bit of a cycle where in order to prove that our community-led model works, we need funding, and in order to get that funding, oftentimes we already need to have the proof that that community-led model works. So it has been a bit of a challenge, and that's something that as a team we are working through to figure out how to best move forward with our community-led scaling and really convince funders that it is something that works. Being a part of this HEA project has impacted our program tremendously because IACT has a relatively small staff, and with our work with both HEA and NYU-TIES, we have felt like we have gained new team members. And each team member has an incredible wealth of knowledge, experience, and expertise that really improves our program and our scaling journey. One thing specifically with NYU-TIES, they have been incredible in helping us with our data collection, with our theory of scale, with our theory of change.
Being a part of the HEA process has also been really impactful because it's just been really cool to be a part of a cohort with peer organizations that are doing, similar things that we're doing. They might not be the exact same things, but just going through the week, I myself was relieved that, oh, we're not the only ones, experiencing these challenges or feeling these struggles or having these pain points. And so, yeah, I was like, phew, okay, reassurance, it's not that we're doing something wrong, but we're just going through this journey together. And it's just helped us, I think, as a team feel, less isolated, less alone in this work. So yeah, it's been really great to just be connected with peers.
My name is Noor Alwer. I'm an M&E specialist with Madrasati. Our innovation is the Masahati Student Clubs, which is an after-school program that builds students' social and emotional competencies. It has a system strengthening view, and that's why we think it's very important to scale Masahati to more public schools around Jordan. One of the things I'm most proud of is deciding on our outcome of interest. We are really excited to start measuring school climate. Even I'm ready if we don't find an impact of Masahati on school climate. This in itself is a major step for us because we are going to learn so much about it, and the learnings we are going to share with the ministry and the other education and emergencies stakeholders are going to be invaluable. The most challenging aspect in our journey to scale is that once you decide to scale, things stop being within your control. When the program is yours, you control everything. You control the training quality, you control, which schools get it, the content, and so on. But once we start to think about scale, it's like the innovation is no longer ours. We have to give it up in a way. We have to, depart with aspects that have been really dear to our hearts. And as a result, the scaling journey, it has been, again, invaluable, but there was a lot of tension within the team because everyone feels that they own this intervention. Everyone loves it for their own reason, and just thinking about giving up control ended up creating tension. The HEA provided us with different tools and also access to different experts who always brought in a new insight, something really valuable that helped release our tensions and I would say think of solutions, think outside the box, think of a new role for us. So even when we were feeling that, overwhelmed with this scaling journey, there was always someone coming in and just, giving us a new perspective, asking a new question or giving us a new tool that always helped us arrive at a good answer or a good vision for what we want to achieve in the scaling journey.
So thank you, Becky, and look forward to Doha Balares and Abi Shakar, who are presenting the NYU Global Ties for Children work as it relates to the Humanitarian Education Accelerator. So look forward to hearing what you have to say, Doha. And I noted in the chat, but if people have questions or comments, please don't hesitate to put them into the chat, and we'll be aggregating some of those questions so that our presenters can answer them later in the event towards the end. So please don't hesitate to put in your comments in the chat. But over to you, Doha.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. So Becky gave a very good background, but I'm going to give you some more and talk about how NYU-TIES got involved in the HA, actually. So UNHCR engaged NYU-TIES as a technical advisor and mentor around monitoring and evaluation for the HA Phase 2 teams. Specifically, we have worked with the teams for over a year to strengthen their capacities to apply theory and research methods to measure, monitor, and evaluate their programs and to make evidence-based decisions, also producing resources and public goods that support teams as they scale and advocate for their programs. So what we'll cover today, we will start with who are we, to understand our goal in participating in the HEA. How do we do it? To learn more about our capacity strengthening approach. What did we co-create with the HEA team? We will share milestones and reflection of our measurement journey. And what did we learn? In order to understand how the HEA fits into a larger capacity strengthening effort to support long-term sustainability. So NYU-TIES is an international research center. We work with non-governmental organizations and with government in low-income and conflict-affected countries to develop, evaluate innovative approaches to promoting holistic development of children and their communities. One of our organizational goal is to develop and support the development of global public goods. One example is, for instance, the gamified digital formative assessment tools that we developed in Jordan and measures developed for use in Lebanon, Niger, and Peru. So we entered the HEA journey as a team who is passionate about research and its potential to make a positive impact, but also being conscious that research could only be truly effective if it's co-created and contextualized with partners who had real-world experience and insight. Our approach to co-developing resources with partners typically look like this. The little characters at the bottom represent in beige the HEA partners role and in purple the NYU-TIES role, showing equal importance of each partner's role. We are working towards generating actionable evidence, first by understanding what evidence exists, and second, by generating culturally and contextually meaningful evidence about what works, why, and for whom. And emphasizing here that the information provides insight about how children are learning and feeling, where the programs are working, and who needs additional resources and support. And third, by sharing learning with stakeholders. So while generating actionable evidence is good, we are committed to generating actionable evidence sustainably, where the process looks a little more like this. There's two key elements to sustainability. First is learning from different contexts and continuing to understand what works, why, and for whom, but also fueled by each other's learning and with the focus on sharing amongst each other and the wider community. And this generation of actionable evidence in a sustainable fashion requires capacity strengthening that involves ongoing support, monitoring, and evaluation to ensure that individuals and HEA organizations are able effectively to apply the skills and knowledge they have gained. We see capacity strengthening as a critical component of sustainable development to empower individuals and communities to take ownership of their own measured development process.
So what does that mean in practice? The models of our work in Lebanon and Peru here are a few examples where over time, the nature of both our and our partners' roles have and continue to change. At the onset of our work in Lebanon, for example, we initially invested a lot in the generation and use of high quality data. Here, our partners were critical to the contextualization of measures, and we had a hand in designing and testing measures and conducting research and analysis. And while our work in Lebanon started off looking more like the bucket all the way on the left, and in Peru we started at a place that looked more like the middle. Depending on the context and the needs of our partners, no matter where we start on this journey, over time, what we see is that pieces of our work, like conducting and interpreting, becomes co-conducting and co-interpreting, and leading turns into facilitating. And these changes we attribute to our approach, which is one that's rooted in collaboration and learning alongside our partners. So in the early stages of partnerships, in addition to the research-related work, developing trust and mutual respect is what we believe allows us to increasingly function within an equitable, nurturing ecosystem alongside our partners, which we see as critical for the sustainability of innovations in the context. And this was the approach we took to the HEA as well, with special attention to 3 pillars of values: active listening, reflection, and innovation. Active listening to understand our partners' needs to develop resources and public goods that are meaningful to the programs. Reflection, not only to identify trends and needs, but also to anticipate future needs. And innovation, to creatively think about how best to support partners in meeting these needs. So constantly asking ourselves, what are the opportunities and barriers we're dealing with? And how can we innovate methods and products to overcome challenges and make best use of opportunities in a sustainable fashion? In designing and refining the course we delivered to the HEA teams, which was a course on adapting holistic learning outcome measures for program monitoring and evaluation, this approach is one of the reasons our timeline of events initially looked like this. So 10 modules covering various measure development, research skills and topics, including outcome definition, measure design, adaptation and testing, and data analysis and visualization. The course we initially mapped out was to be delivered over 12 months with some one-to-one sessions sprinkled in between. But we waited and practiced some flexibility and ended up with a course that looked a little more like this. 9 modules with 11 individualized sessions, with adjustments to the content and the delivery of the course as we continue to learn more about the teams throughout it. We recognized that the course was intense and to be completed over a relatively short period of time. So in order to make best use of our time, it was really important to us to understand the different places each of the teams are at to scaffold learning in a way that creates optimal conditions for learning. And what that looked like was lots of feedback surveys before the course, after every module, and after the course, so that we were able to tailor our content and delivery according to the feedback, and to the extent possible, providing resources ahead of sessions and after sessions to further support learning. The additional resources were especially important because of the time constraints. We want to ensure that the materials were freely available to the teams to be explored at their own pace, even beyond the HEA. And finally, another change that arose from our approach were the addition of a lot more individual one-to-one tailored sessions, so that there was space for questions and discussions beyond the full group sessions and activity sessions. And though time was constrained, we achieved a lot. This is an overview of some of the team's key milestones, which are signified by the golden trophies. But over the course of the HEA with the teams, we co-developed resources to help guide the scaling journey, from interactive theories of change to measures of outcomes that were meaningful to the programs, to data dashboards to disseminate findings. We piloted the measures, analyzed the data that came from it, and visualized it. And finally, the Great Acts Trophy is something we're currently cooking up, packaging their amazing work into global public goods. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Dua to take us to some of what we co-developed in more detail.
So what did we co-create? Over the past 9 months, a lot was achieved, and this is a testament to the dedication of the teams to not just their work, but also to the people we are working for. We piloted, finalized 3 measures in 3 languages. A measure of school climate in Jordanian Arabic that covered different types of relations, engagement, belonging, and safety. A measure of organizational capacity in Kiswahili that covered critical thinking and participatory approach, and a measure in community capacity in Sudanese Arabic covering leadership and work climate. We created data dashboards to disseminate results in a more visual and creative way for it to be better understood and make informed decisions about assessment improvement. I have been sitting in the first row, witnessing the tremendous work from the teams that went into creating these global public goods. We will be submitting them to the EiEPC measurement library, hoping to contribute to the wider sector by strengthening collaborative knowledge. We will also be packaging not just the measure itself, but also as a global public good, the processes we used to get here in the format of Kaya e-course. So what have we learned? Now you're going to be hearing a message from Dr. Carly Tibbs-Dolan, who is the Deputy Director of NYU Global Ties for Children, and she is the lead instructor for this HEA.
This idea of scale and what that means and what's possible, and particularly in humanitarian settings, I think is something that we at TIES have been interested in thinking about for a long time. And so the learning from the teams about what that actually looks like for them and what their strategies are has been incredible. And I think for me, from all of the teams in different ways, one of the things that came out very strongly as we were developing their program theories of change was the focus on sustainability in their programs. And so making sure that even if funding was not available, even if they themselves were the ones who were going to be implementing the interventions, how are they preparing the people that they were working with, which are refugee-led organizations or teachers or community staff members, to really own the programs and take them. And that part, it's trying to work at scale, but trying to work at scale in a way that's sustainable. And I think those 2 pieces have really come out very strongly for me in the work with the teams.
So what does it take to mutually strengthen capacity in this way? Strengthening mutual capacity to generate meaningful, actionable evidence requires time, resources, and supports. Resources for the recruitment and retainment of long-term hires that include community members, dedicated time to strengthen skills, and for connectivity and access to softwares and training on data management, collection, and analysis. Support is another critical element to strengthening capacity to ensure both individuals and institutions have opportunities to high-quality professional development.
It also requires relationships that are rooted in trust, mutual respect, and committed to learn from and through each other, which provides opportunities to practice and master skills and principles in the resources. And that are equitably and sustainably funded. So with attention to meaningful actions to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion, and doing so in a way that builds in longer-term flexible funding that supports the development of skills and allows for creativity and trust. So why do partnerships like this matter? So what we are taking away from the organization, the 3HA organization, and reflection from our own team is this: supportive partnerships provide an opportunity for dialogue and exchange around the principles, practices, and skills included in resources and support. They transform each other's understanding, awareness, and perspective. This came up also in the learning synthesis as well. And these shifts in perspectives is critical for long-term system change. Thank you. Looking forward to your questions.
Abby and Doha, thank you so much. Really nice to see the work that you've been doing, and I think some nice questions are coming up in the chat, and we'll get a chance to respond to those or ask you to think about some of those questions later on. And then for the sort of third bucket or the third section of our presentations, really excited to hear from the Cohere team in Uganda. And so I wanted to welcome Carol Kapatanya, who's the head of programs and compliance, Angela Bulamu, who's the program lead, and then Paul Kitima, who is the director for the Bandeku Refugee Livelihood Center. So really excited to hear about some of the partners who've been working on this program in Uganda, and so that we can get a sense for the scaling journey that Becky and Doha and Abi have been speaking of from the perspective of the Ugandan community in Cohere. So over to you, Carol, and thank you for the presentation.
Thank you. Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Perfect, Carol, we've got it. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I'll begin with introductions. I'm Caroline Kabatanya, and I oversee programs and compliance at Cohere, and I'm based in Uganda.
My name is Angela Bulamu. I am a program lead at Cohere, based in Uganda.
My name is Paul Kitima. I'm the Executive Director of Bandeku Refugee Livelihood Center, but also the chairperson of the Bright Future Consortium that assists children with disabilities, and the leader of the GILOS, the Grassroots Consortium. Thanks.
Okay, so what are we going to cover? We're going to share with you who we are, our model, our innovation, our scaling journey, and how we plan to grow our model as well, and then maybe share more about sustainability of the innovation that we're going to share with you today. So who we are at Cohere, we want to see refugees determine their futures. As such, we work closely with refugee-led organizations who lead on interventions, thus building stronger communities and forging paths towards self-reliance. Our model of elevating the role of refugee organizations in the humanitarian response focuses on 4 strategic areas. That is capacity strengthening, funding, coordination, and advocacy. And in capacity strengthening, the focus is on offering tailored support to organizations, the refugee-led organization, to ensure they effectively respond to the needs of their communities. And then under funding, we create opportunities to fund refugee-led organizations at scale. And with coordination, we ensure that refugee-led organizations are connected to the wide humanitarian sector through showcasing their work. There's a platform called reframe.network where several RLOs have been able to profile what they're doing. And then in advocacy, we support refugee-led organizations generate evidence but also which they can be used to influence donor and implementing partners. So regarding our theory of change, it involves a system change that demonstrates a new way of funding, in this case, the frontline responders, the refugee-led organization, which requires supporting the refugee leadership through providing the right tools and resources to scale sustainably, hence achieving the set outcomes for their communities.
Sorry, do you guys mind putting the presentation in presentation mode, please?
Oh, okay, please.
Thank you. Just so it makes it bigger for everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yes, Angela, please share about our project evolution.
Okay, so now over to the project. The project evolved over a period. Initially as a pilot in 2019, Cohere implemented the inclusive education for children with disabilities in 2 locations. Following our success with the pilot, we were able to acquire resources and scale to a 3rd location, still led by Cohere. 2020, however, brought in lessons that we had not foreseen at the moment. And because we had challenges with access, it had us rethink how we wanted to intervene. Because as early as 2020, we were co-opting and requesting for the RLOs to support us during that implementation. In 2021, we progressed to still implementing the 3 locations with increased support from the refugee-led organization, but as well got insight into how we could be able to sustainably reach the children with disabilities, even with challenges like what we faced in 2020. With support from the HEA, which we went through as early as 2021, we were able to streamline our role as a support to the RLOs, support the RLOs, therefore, to implement at 4 locations with an additional location, with the RLOs taking charge of implementation, which is the key to achieving sustainability, and Cohere in the background as a support. In 2022, we implemented the community-led inclusive education for children with disabilities, which was largely implemented by the RLOs with funding from the HEA. We were able to subgrant the RLOs to take lead on the core aspects of the program, which included them taking lead on the activities that involved assessing the children, which were done by the specialists. But of course, with the RLOs taking lead, it meant that they did all the activities with the mobilization, reaching out to the leaders, and ensuring that the specialists were there to diagnose any children who were brought to for assessments during the activities. As well, following the kind of disability that the child had, the severity of the same, the specialists were able to support through recommending a device that could be applied to support the children to improve. The parents did receive the necessary training to be able to support the children effectively use the devices at their homes for registering improvement in the conditions of the children. As part of the innovation as well, school physical improvements were implemented at several schools that were enrolled, again with the leadership of the refugee-led organizations. Such include pathways like the one we see in picture, ramps and adaptable latrines to support the children enjoy their stay in school for those that were accessing formal education.
Sorry, Angela, I believe your slides have stopped changing.
Oh.
We're still seeing the project evolution slide.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
There we go. We've moved. Now we can see the.
Okay. All right. As part of the feels like I hear an echo. Sorry about that. As part of the innovation as well, we have activities that, again, led by the RLOs, targeted the parents to ensure that they can support the academic development of the children while at home, and as well the teachers to ensure that the children that go on to attend formal education are able to be effectively engaged so as to ensure that their kind of development in school is meaningful and beneficial to their development. So how did we get here? It was a journey that we would not necessarily have achieved without HEA and all the support that they had in place. So part of the support were the boot camps in which we were learning from our peers like Ikan and Madarasati, as shared earlier. We were able to effectively reflect on what we were thinking about in terms of our innovation, polish up and refine our model based on the learning from peers and as well the support from HEA overall, unpack the ecosystems, including key activities like mapping that were key for the operations and stakeholder engagement, which became extremely vital when implementation came into play. We also were supported through the community of practice, which again brought together our peers and as well consultants from different walks of life, who supported us to further streamline our business models, think through what these were, think through evaluations in terms of how our scale will look like, how we were moving towards that, and as well supported us to think through who the partnerships were that were vital and key for the scale overall. A key element that supported us through the entire journey was the meal aspect with NYU-TIES for children, which was really critical in us fully understanding what the intervention was, what outcomes we were envisioning in as far as the intervention, being able to select and adapt high quality measures to check if we were moving and progressing rightly to the outcomes, and if we were not, then what would we have to do? As part of the activities, we went through key learnings on the M&E front, including sampling, and we were able to carry out cognitive interviews and come up with an organizational capacity assessment tool. This tool is currently being deployed to further understand the capacities of RLOs and as well work with them to develop their capacity strengthening journeys that we work on together with them. By looking at the qualitative data and quantitative, the analysis and the data visualization, we were able not only to see what the data looked like, but as well guide any decisions that were made during the implementation. Using COBO, which by the way has now been pretty much co-opted by all the refugee-led organizations working on this project.
Thank you, Angela. Regarding our scaling plan, HEA was very instrumental in supporting Cohere work out the plan. And so by 2022, 4 partner refugee-led organizations were sub-granted to carry out different interventions for children with disabilities, thus reaching 1,200 children with 6 conditions, that is hydron microcephalus, epilepsy, cerebral palsy, Down syndrome, and autism. So this year, Cohere will continue supporting the 4 partner organizations through different interventions. And we hope by 2024, more children are reached by 12 refugee-led organizations in 3 countries regarding different varied needs, education varied needs, not necessarily disability. And then by 2031, the number of children reached will increase in 5 countries. How do we plan to grow the model? Like I mentioned before, our focus is on the 4 strategic areas of coordination, capacity strengthening and funding, as well as advocacy. We are working towards ensuring that refugee-led organizations lead in all the 4 areas. In coordinations, they're effective networks and they're managing the coordination platform. Under capacity, they're involved in capacity strengthening and sharing best practices. They have access to funding directly from donors, or they're funded through their coordination platform. And lastly, advocacy is refugee-led. So the goal is to have refugees lead in the humanitarian response by designing their own result frameworks, sharing their results, proving impact, and advocating for this way of working. So Paul can share more regarding sustainability, especially when it comes to this innovation.
Yeah. Thanks, Carol. Unfortunately, I can't see the presentation. I don't know if the problem is coming from me. So, yeah, there are so many similarities between Bondeco's vision and Cohere's vision when it comes to the protection of children with disability. So I'm not going to repeat what my colleagues from Cohere have said in the presentation. So let me just be straightforward and just talk about the Bright Future Consortium. So I initiated this consortium last year with 3 other RLOs and 1 local organization by nationals, but these are the physiotherapists and occupational therapists, our in-house specialists. And we are not like all of us operating from one location. We are in different locations. So 3 of us are in the refugee settlement in Bidibidi, Rwamwanja, and Mvepi, and the 2 of us are operating from Kampala. As a platform, we already have 1,200 children with disabilities under the 6 conditions mentioned by my predecessor. So we were able to achieve this thanks to the funding from HEA through Cohere. But due to the fact that this funding was earmarked, we could only focus on 6 conditions. So we couldn't include other forms of disability. So as we continue giving out our support to the children we already identified, at the same time, we keep looking for more funding so that we can scale up our project and reach out to more children and to different forms of disabilities. And if we manage to get more resources and maybe more flexible funding, we'd like also to support the parents of these children, because these are impoverished people who are living with less than $1 a day per family. And having a child with disability in such family, the life can be even very hard. So we're having different projects in livelihoods, and that can support them if funded. So we're planning to carry out also sensitization campaigns in schools and in different communities so that we can mitigate some of the challenges and barriers faced by the children with disabilities and their families, like discrimination and exclusion from different activities in the community. So I'd like to recognize that during the implementation of this project, we've learned a lot as organization and individually, either through the boot camp by HEA, NYU-TIES, or just from the field. And at the end, we've learned a lot through this experience, and that has inspired some critical learning questions. Like how can the consortium continue supporting these children beyond the HEA fund? Secondly, we're asking ourselves, how can we continue supporting these children beyond the initial project focus? And lastly, how can the consortium be part of global initiatives that are existing now in humanitarian world? So to conclude, I have the following call for action. There is a need for more refugee participation in humanitarian response in the context of localization. So allow me to raise my case at this stage. Thanks.
Oh, apologies with the presentation. I think there was something.
No, please. I have to say that in this time when we're all working virtually, that the ways in which trying to get presentations to work just as designed is always a challenge, but I wanted to applaud everyone for, one, putting together very nice presentations, and two, the fact that we were resilient enough to get, for instance, all the videos to work and to get into presentation mode was a nice testimony to the work that we're all trying to do to be resilient and work in sometimes fragile situations, regardless of where one's operating. I wanted to finish off handing the floor back to Kate, because part of what I think we've been hearing is some really nice examples about how the HEA has operated and some of the lessons that we've learned from that. But and I wanted to encourage my colleagues from Cohere and Bondeco to look in the chat. There were some specific questions about how you operated and how you were able to get a couple of things done that I think it's worth reflecting on. And then when we get to the Q&A session, we'll pull some of those together. But Kate, I know that you've been working hard to take some of the global lessons, some of the global public goods from all of this good work over many years. And I wonder if you could share some of those.
Thank you. And have you got my presentation in front of you?
Yep.
Excellent. So one of the underlying reasons that we wanted to do this webinar today is because we want to share with you the global public goods that we've created. Because although the HEA is not going to be running any longer, we do have a lot of knowledge and experience that we'd like to share, and hopefully will influence future activities in this space. So I've put to here that's 5 of the main global public goods that we've produced, all available on this URL. And I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about a couple of them, just so you can get an idea of what they're about. Oh dear, my slide's not changing. Oh, there we go. So the first is a learning paper on financing scale. And the reason we chose this topic is because, as you've seen in the chat today, as you've heard from Becky, you've heard from Paul, you've heard from Cohere, financing is a major barrier. And we want to look into it a little bit more, understand what's going on, what the ecosystem's like, where the barriers are, and how we can potentially overcome them. So the learning paper looks at the following sort of issues and chapters. First of all, it looks at the fact that scale is not just one thing. There are different stages of scale. And it's important to know that because different types of funding are attracted to different stages of scale. So for example, you start with the transition to scale, then there's scaling up, scaling out, there's sustainable scale, and each of these stages require different types of funding. The second thing is that there's different scaling pathways that can lead to sustainable scale. And again, that opens up and closes off opportunities for funding. For example, if your sustainable scale journey is to be adopted by government, then government budgets open up. Whereas if you're looking at a more private sector model, then you have to look at things more like subscriptions rather than accessing government budgets. The third thing is that there's different financing types and sources. So there are little sort of innovation pots, there are sort of that sort of seed funding, and that's what the HEA was. You know, it gives a small sum of money at the beginning, it gets things up and running, but it won't necessarily lead to sustainable scale. There are different types of funding you have to access along the way. So there's humanitarian and development funding. There's funding from philanthropical organizations, foundations, from the private sector. Then there's government budgets. So understanding what you're eligible for and what you can access is really important because you don't want to waste time trying to get money that you're not actually eligible for. Then when you've got the money, what do you spend it on? So this paper identifies the activities that really help with scaling. So that's where the money should really be prioritized. And finally, the paper ends with recommendations. So that's innovators, how to understand the ecosystem better, how to be define what you're eligible for and do the best sort of application. But really importantly, there's recommendations towards funders and donors saying, look, if you really want to help, let's create this pipeline. Let's ensure that the funding works together, that your part leads to my part, leads to the final part, so that innovations can go the whole way through. They can start with a transition to scale and reach sustainable scale and be financially supported the whole way. Because currently there's a lot of gaps in between these stages, and really impactful innovations risk getting lost in these gaps. So the second global public good I'd like to talk to you about is the learning synthesis. So this is a compilation of all the lessons we've learned over the past 7 years in 3 cohorts. And the way it's structured is that we begin with the background and context to the HEA. And Becky spoke to you a bit at the beginning about why the HEA was set up. So we highlight those issues. The second section looks at the HEA experience and insights, and we look at each of the cohorts. What did we learn? What did we change? And then in the third section, we look at the overall lessons. So what did we learn overall in the 7 years? And we relate that back to section 1. What has the HEA addressed limited funding? Has it addressed the evidence issue? What have we learned? What have we done? And what have we changed? And what still needs to happen? And again, it ends with recommendations. Recommendations for innovators, for donors, funders, other stakeholders, and also for future accelerators. So if anyone else is working in this space, we want to make sure that they can learn what we've learned in the last 7 years. And the final global public good I'd like to talk to you about are the external evaluations. So as Becky pointed out at the beginning, there is a lack of evidence. There's a lack of understanding what works, what doesn't, and more guidance as to how to scale. So we commissioned 3 external evaluations. So an external evaluator came in and worked with our 3 final innovation teams to look at their innovations, to look at the education solution, to look at the innovation process and scaling model, and reflect back on what's working and what needs improvement. And so these external evaluations, they're quite comprehensive, 140, 160 pages long, and the teams can use these to reflect on their journey so far and sort of plan for the future. And we have decided to publish the executive summaries of these. So the executive summaries of these evaluations are available on our website, and they're really useful for everybody else to get an idea of what's working and what's not. So that's just the global public goods. The URL is here. We would love if people to read them, share them, because we think there's some really important lessons in there, and we just want to ensure that they're captured and hopefully influence future projects. Thank you. And I'll hand back to Rob.
Kate, thanks. And to all the presenters, really been very, very grateful for the presentations you've given. And I'd like to use the next 20, 25 minutes till the end of the session to sort of turn back to you. And I think we'll do this in reverse order, where we've got some questions for the Cohere team. There are some questions from the NYU team, NYU-TIES team, and then a couple for Becky. But I think to start that questioning session, and I should say, please do not hesitate to put more questions into the chat if you have them, and we'll try to incorporate those in real time. But I'd encourage each of our presenters to look through some of those chat questions. There are a couple that came out, but I wanted to start with just a comment from my side, which was I really like the way these presentations sort of tell the journey, but also talk about the need to be systematic and envision at the outset the way in which we want to scale up some of this work, and to think creatively about those sectoral barriers, to think about the funding pipeline, to think about building evidence, and obviously to then think about bringing together skills and knowledge. And in some ways, those ending on the skills and knowledge and the global public goods that came from it, Kate, is a nice sort of reflection of that systematic thinking about how we scale up the innovations that have been done. There were some specific questions, and I'm going to pose it to the Cohere team, and anyone, Angela, Carol, Paul. There were a couple of questions I thought about the specifics of what you were able to get done. Very exciting to hear about that work and its possibility of moving forward. Specifically, were there any criteria for the types of RLOs that you wanted to work with? And then what were some of the ways that you were sharing data or looking to create some of those sectoral links with health organizations, with community development CBOs, in order to share some of that data. So let me first turn to Angela, Carol, and Paul in whatever order the three of you would like to go, to see whether or not you can respond to some of those questions, or if there are any reflections that you have from having heard these other presentations. So over to our Ugandan colleagues.
Okay, thank you. Angela, do you want to go first?
I actually thought you were going to go, but
no problem. No problem.
Yeah, but it's something that apparently we do quite a lot. But when it comes to the organizations that we were keen to work with, considering that, again, we have been working with refugee-led organizations from the start, and they were critical for us identifying, for example, the community outreach workers that we worked with as far back as 2019. So it was easy to kind of fall back to the same RLOs that had shown the interest at that stage to support in 2020 when the crisis hit, and therefore it was the same organizations that we worked with. But overall, when you look at our model, we have an approach that is open and taking in RLOs of various levels, but usually directed by what they are working on. And so if, for example, we have a funder that is interested in reaching out to refugee-led organizations, we would then call out for a proposal based on who is working in that sector and already has work in the area. And so we would work with them to further strengthen their capacity and strengthen their portfolio in the sectors that they are already engaged in. And when it comes to the question on data sharing, a lot of the data, especially within our sectors, we have sectoral meetings at which all players would come. So, for example, within each location, times to reflect on education and reflect on the key aspects thereof. And so at those meetings, we as Cohere, but as well, greatly the refugee-led organizations are there to share what they have found in the field, what they have been able to achieve, what has progressed and what is lacking. And indeed, those have been key, especially sharing with OPM, Office of the Prime Minister in Uganda, sharing with health organizations, which are key for referrals. For example, a number of children on the project who had epilepsy had been written off, but with the collaboration with health organizations, we were able to get them into a space where they can access medication and therefore improve their conditions. Many of the children that we succeeded in taking to school or having enrolled during the program are children that actually had epilepsy, which is easy to manage, but because of that gap, they were not actually accessing the necessary information. Further engagement with other CBOs in different locations have brought collaboration on different aspects of the program, especially right now being taken lead of by the refugee-led organizations again. And I think offhand, I can think of BDBD, where there's a partnership going on with another player in the area to see how they can then streamline the data, know that no one is receiving the same support twice, but as well know who needs what support when, so that then they can coordinate in delivering that support within BDBD settlement. Around capacity, the tool that we use for sharing capacity is an open source. Carol, do you want to share maybe a link or something? Carol, if you want to talk more about that. But yes, it's information that we freely share. It is accessible and anyone can be able to use it, although a number of times, again, we support the partner RLOs to walk through it through the process of strengthening the capacity. Thank you.
Oh, yes, I'm going to share it, yes. It currently has 18 modules, mainly organization capacity, from understanding your community, proving impact, communicating your vision and mission, yes. So.
Thanks, Carol. And Carol, if you have a link that you can even put in the chat, I'm seeing that there are some of the materials that we've been talking about are being put in the chat, and we've had more than 70 people in this group, and having it just there in the chat is a nice way to get some of that information out in almost real time. Paul, any reflections on some of the issues you've been hearing about the scaling?
Yes, exactly. I wanted just to say that in our approach of how we can scale up this project as a platform, we have started already. We are collaborating from the beginning with other RLOs and other organizations at the grassroots level, because our approach is a bottom-up approach. We work a lot with the community, and most of our strategies are coming from the feedback from the community. And also as well, we are going to see how to expand to have a partnership at international level with other organizations, international organizations and UN agencies, to see how we can work better, how to do more efficiently this work we are carrying out. So that's the things I wanted just to add.
Thanks, Paul, Carol, and Angela. Really useful. I'm going to then pass it to Doha and Abi, and see if there are any of there were a couple of specific questions that were posed while you were speaking, and one specifically about this sort of planning or envisioning scale at the outset, or whether or not it was a more iterative process. What were the pathways that you explored, and how could you pass on ideas and thoughts about those scaling pathways? I also, as a person who in my past has done a lot of evaluation, I was interested in some of the specific question about doing M&E in mobile populations, because the humanitarian population that we're talking about in this case are obviously by definition mobile. So if you have any thoughts on those, over to you.
Sure. I can kick us off.
Sure.
So I think each of the teams came in with a vision for scale that was sort of reiterated throughout the HCA journey. In terms of targets for scale, I think the work the teams did in fleshing out the theories of change, so defining outcomes, adapting measures, in order to map out over time how program activities and inputs can lead to program changes in program outcomes. That was the critical piece in building the foundations for an evidence-based approach to scale. Yeah, and on I don't know, Dua, if you want to add anything to that? No. And working on the mobile populations front, a lot of the tools that we used as much as possible were open access or free to use. So ensuring that even in our collection methods, using things like Kobo to ensure that internet connection, it's not dependent on certain factors. Yeah, I think that's about it.
Duha, do you wanted to add anything, or we'll leave it there? Okay, thanks.
I'm going to leave it there. That's great.
Okay, no, that's excellent. And then the last but not least, we'll go back to Becky and to some extent also to Kate on the overall sort of HEA framework. And you'll see in the chat, and I don't need to read them for you, but just so that others, you can choose which of these you want to speak to. But I thought there were some interesting questions in there, specifically about sort of the view of whether education innovation support space is growing, particularly with refugees communities. Is this, part about what we're talking about scaling is supports innovations, and then you hope those innovations take root and sort of take a life on their own. And I wanted to see whether or not some of our participants in the webinar are interested in getting a sense for whether or not what the trend is from your perspective, and how does that relate to some of the issues that we're looking at with regard to unrestricted funding, I, as a funder at the World Bank and as a funder that works almost exclusively with governments, I think there's some really interesting issues about the role of government in providing some of these services on a long-term basis. What are some of the ways in which you can ensure scalability over the long term of service delivery? But part of when we're talking about the fragile space, and this is what makes the fragile FCV working group so interesting, is that there isn't necessarily sustainability or scalability of government implementation capacity in these settings. But just wanted to get some of your reflections, Becky, on what you heard in the chat or in the larger conversation. I'll leave it to you and Kate to decide how you split those questions up.
Great, thanks. Kate, if it's all right, I'll just take all the easy ones and then you can have the rest. So I think I wanted to start looking at this question on governments, because I think it relates to a lot of the other pieces, right? So innovations in education and EiEPC necessarily are part of an ecosystem and an education architecture, right? There are also bigger questions and conversations than kind of live in the innovation space. So I think there's been a huge recognition in education and emergencies more broadly that governments have to be in the lead. Governments being in the lead does not necessarily mean that we expect the use of domestic finance for the delivery of education. And I think what we see, particularly in refugee settings, is not an unwillingness for that, but where you've got 85% of refugees in lower middle income countries, the number of priorities that they have for host populations, the capacity that was just being talked about, governments are potentially unable to take on some of these costs, right? So I think one of the conversations we had a lot in HEA was like scale and sustainability planning very much was built around an idea that government takes over. And it was found that actually in the majority of cases, that's not realistic. There are, I think, relationships between that and then how we think about innovation and scale. So one of the presentations was saying actually during the HEA journey, what we had to do was unpick the kind of very holistic approach that we really loved and look at what are specific elements of this solving for and how are they really going to plug a gap, because we are unlikely to have an innovation that solves for education, right? It's much more likely to be you have a number of providers, your policy framework and everything is set by the government, curriculum is set by the government, the way things are rolled out happen ideally within those structures. So there was a question about parallel systems, but there has been a huge shift away from the creation of parallel systems in the first place. So there's a big shift towards the provision of education and emergencies starting off at least designed for inclusion and designed for development. And I think that's important because it also takes us back to this idea that actually scale doesn't have to be fast. A lot of implementation that we do has to be fast, right? But even that kind of transition into the kind of development space or the government space can really be quite slow. So looking at what is needed and when, and I think that's also where the kind of sustainability and financing pipeline piece comes in is really important. And recognizing that, what we're doing within the innovation space really does need to dock into those kind of shifts and what's happening in terms of the delivery of education and emergencies. And I would say especially protracted crisis, because that's where you have that much closer kind of engagement. So yeah, theories of change, working out what your innovation solves for, and those things are really important. And it's also a real gap, I think, amongst a lot of innovations in terms of knowing what they're doing and kind of really having answers to a question that someone is asking, right? And I think we see a huge growth in kind of innovation. And I would say, for me, the people who are able to kind of answer and respond to those questions are the local level organizations, because they see the gaps for real, right? They see them on the ground. They're able to explain, okay, whatever is available for education works in this way, but it doesn't serve this group of people, or it doesn't work, for this particular element of the curriculum, or whatever it is. They're able to see that. I think one of the questions was around the kind of innovation space growing. And I think one thing that we see, and this is probably a personal opinion more than anything else, one thing that we see is a growth of interest of private sector in terms of getting involved now also in education and in education in emergencies. And I mean, there was a paper about private sector engagement with education in the Syria response across that whole region, and something like 80% of those responses were basically untested private sector edtech solutions that they wanted to test. So one of the things that I have is very often you will have private sector support where they're looking to solve for a problem that doesn't really exist. And that's why kind of pulling together the local knowledge, the local insights, you know, community like rationale, and with governments as well to look at those gaps, and then bringing them together with the kind of innovation support space, which absolutely should involve private sector, you know, where they have the knowledge about building some of these things out, building scaling journeys, and some of the financing, I think is a very exciting conversation to have, and it's kind of supporting everyone to play their role. In terms of donors, there is, I think, you know, one of the things that I would really sort of call for, having looked at HEA, is that there are a huge number of big programs out there, right? So there's a lot of money spent to support education, including from the World Bank. And what would be exciting would be to have kind of small support windows under that, which look specifically at innovation and what it means to fund, you know, scaling journeys, capacity, skills, etc., and how that works. And it could be, you know, FCDO, for example, so the UK Foreign Office, they had a Girls' Education Challenge program, which was hundreds of millions, and it was a brilliant program. If they had within that chosen to say, we're going to have a small window which focuses on innovation and scale, then actually they might have had slightly different decisions, and they might have had a longer term impact in some areas, because actually they were funding innovations, right? They were funding some of these small pilots, but without a kind of metric to assess those, to commit to them, to be able to fund non-traditional things within traditional education grants, I think is something that we struggle with. And we did work, I put it in the chat, but we worked in the technical reference group on HEA with a number of particular private sector foundations. And I think I see a lot of exciting windows within those private sector foundations, partly because they can be very flexible. I don't think it needs to be unrestricted necessarily. I mean, if you're an INGO, for example, and you are trying to deliver a massive education response, you have unrestricted funding. I don't know whether that incentivizes you to try innovations or whether it just incentivizes you to kind of keep going with business as usual. I think that would need to be tested. But there are also those kind of the private sector foundations where they're also able to do kind of other things. So I think Portugal's support to Moving Minds Alliance really helped look at how do you do peer-to-peer support? How do you share learnings? How do you look at embedding capacity in some of these areas? Not just to do them, but also to demand the evidence, right? And to expect that the evidence pieces will actually be used, and to put those different conversations into play at different levels. So I'm going to stop there. I know there are lots of other questions, but Kate, other thoughts from you?
I don't have anything to add, Becky. I think that was a really good response. And I think if there's any other more specific questions, Rob, or if you wanted to do the wrap up, because I see we've only got 3 minutes left.
Well, no, first of all, I think with just a few minutes left, and in respect of people's time, I know that in some of the settings it may be getting late. Let me give a couple of quick reflections, or to try to wrap up, and that is in no way going to summarize what has been a wonderfully rich and interesting conversation. But in some ways, I want to go back, Becky, to the sort of first set of categories in your first presentation. And in some ways, for me, that as a person, well, as we're all people who are thinking about scaling and thinking about the best ways to, when there are good innovate, well, on the one hand, one wants to promote innovation as much as possible, particularly in fragile settings where we need, it's almost always going to be the case that one needs to think of small activities that happen at the community level or in smaller groups, but you want those to last, you want those to grow, you want good ideas to be shared, you want them to be supported. And I thought that the sort of 4 framework points that were at the beginning of your presentation, Becky, about thinking about cutting across sectoral barriers. All of this work, particularly in FCV settings, particularly when looking for innovations in education, are not just about education. They are about thinking about working across sectors, and that may be, you know, different actors within the communities, including government, but NGOs and private sector. I think that being as systematic and forward-looking as possible about a pipeline, and that is a funding pipeline, but it's also a sort of institutional and support and partnership pipeline brought writ large, and those partnerships may not be exactly who was thought about at the outset, but we hope that we all can be flexible to follow different pathways for how that pipeline of support can grow. I think that it is always going to be vitally important to go to evidence and to think about the ways in which we can be gathering evidence and learning from what seems to work, what seems to not work. It's learning from failure as well, and ways in which you can take that evidence, collect it, and put it together in strong lessons. And then the final point, and this ends in some ways where the presentation ends, is to make sure you gather those skills and knowledge. Because when we are, as a community of people who are thinking about scaling, particularly in FCV settings, where the institutional opportunities for scaling both across time, space, and financing are particularly weak, almost by definition, I think one of the things that is most possible for scaling to work is through ideas to be spread, and that the lessons about what works and the inspiration, frankly, that comes through what can work is a way that scaling can happen. It's one of the more powerful pathways, particularly in FCV settings. So with that as a closing comment, I really want to thank all our presenters for first of all, for all the work you've been doing for such a long time, and excellent efforts and results, for the presentations you've given, which have been inspiring, who are helping to scale some of that knowledge and learning. And then finally, to all the people who joined this presentation. I think at one point we had 80 people joining, and so yeah, I'm joining the rest of the people who are virtually clapping their hands, but really want to thank you all. And thanks for also the resources that you've put online, and that we'll use that to keep some of the good work you've been doing being shared. So all have a great day.
Thank you, Rob, for your moderation. That was great.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Thank you all very much.
See you all. I can get my clap to work. Okay, have a good day, everyone.